All right, good afternoon. Welcome to our final session for this quarter. What I want to do today, obviously, is finish up our discussion of the objective logic. What I'm going to do, roughly in this order, is I'm going to talk about, sort of from a summary point of view, that's what this thing up on the screen is about. It's on D2L as well. So that's an attempt, a bad attempt, but it's an attempt to summarize the entirety of the objective logic, that is, the doctrine of being and the doctrine of essence in premise conclusion form, which of course is nowhere to be found in Hegel, and that's a good thing, I think, because he's actually laying out arguments. Here I'm just giving us a roadmap. So I know it has the pretense of looking like a formally deductive proof of some kind or another. I really don't mean it to be that. I'm really just trying to identify, here are the, the essential moments in the argument itself. Here's what the conclusions are, that kind of thing. So hopefully it's helpful in that regard. Then I want to come down and look, after we've taken a bit of time with that, I want to come back and look at this notion of manifestation, focus on that claim about manifestation, and then look at its two sides, right, modality and causality. So we talked about modality last time. We'll go back and rehearse some of the things there. We'll talk more principally about causality today, so I'll talk about that. And then the final thing that he does, I want to leave for next quarter. The final thing he does, this is on the very, of course, last page, transitional, always difficult. But that's why I've got the same text assigned for the first session of the next quarter, the winter quarter, is he makes the claim there that necessity has been raised to freedom, right? And, you should, if you didn't, right, should be shocked. I mean, you're shocked. Maybe you're used to being shocked at this point in reading this text. What other preposterous thing can he talk about, right? Okay, now this one. But that one ought to really shock you, because what's freedom got to do with logic, right? And certainly what's it got to do with necessity? And notice he's claiming there not that freedom and necessity are reconcilable. He's not claiming that they're reconcilable. He's claiming that necessity is freedom. So what do we mean by freedom? How does it make sense? Why are we even talking about it in the logic? All those are questions that we'll take up at the beginning of next quarter, right? So we'll be at that question of what is freedom, how is necessity raised to freedom in the logic, all that kind of stuff is stuff for that. The handout I've given you, I'll talk a little bit about some of that stuff today. I'll come back to that same material in the handout, particularly the two corollaries at the end of it. It's a way of putting the claims that he's making that followed from these other things. I'll talk about those more next quarter, right? All right, I think that's it by way of preview of what we're doing today. Let me just remind you before I take questions and issues that you might have to bring up, just to remind you, I know you don't want to think about this, but we do need to think about it one last time. So two things to remind you of here. One, I sent out an email today, I'm sure you all got that, about doing your online teaching evaluations. If you haven't done those already, please, I appreciate that some of you have. If you have not done those, please, they will close soon, so please be sure and go online and do that. I value those tremendously, as I said in the email today. It helps me figure out how to teach this class, how not to teach this class, and other classes as well, so it's incredibly valuable to me. Many of you are doing this for the first time in this class, so remember that it's completely anonymous. I never know what the comments are, what the evaluations are, who they're from. I never know that. I do get to see the comments. I only see those, the evaluations and the comments, only after grades have been submitted. So it can't affect your grade in any kind of way, no matter what you say, right? So I appreciate straightforward honesty. I appreciate constructive criticism. I've been told many times in these, I've been doing this for 30 years, so you can imagine. I've been told many things on evaluations. I've been told, you're the best. I've been told, you're an asshole. Usually something more constructive than either one of those, right, is helpful, right? So if you think something went well in the class, try to identify that and tell me what that is. If something didn't go well in the class, tell me about that and try to identify that. That helps me tremendously. But yeah, I already know I'm an angel, I'm an asshole, I know that. But let's try to be more specific, right, in our comments. That'd be really useful and helpful to me. So I appreciate you taking the time. Most often I would do this in class, but we've got too much to do today, so I'm going to focus on the material we've got to cover. So please don't take that as an excuse not to do it. Please do it. All right. The other thing to remind you of is your exegetical assignments are due by no later than the 25th. Of November. Remember, that's by 11:59 p.m. on that day, D2L midnight, so there's submission folders open currently. You can submit already. Some of you have, so if you are working on that, I encourage you to have already selected that passage if you haven't, if you're behind. And you've got a couple weeks now to really work on that and dedicate yourself to that. Remember, I'm asking you to do two things, right? What's being said in the passage, why is it being said, right? So what's being claimed there by Hegel? Always difficult and hard. in and of itself. And then why is he claiming that? It's obviously many times those are going to be conclusions to a train of argumentation. You don't have to go all the way back to the start of the train of argumentation, all the way back to being is nothing. You don't have to go back there. But you do need to go back to the relevant part that's trying to be discussed there in that particular passage and bring it forward to that particular section, that particular passage. Remember, no secondary sources for that, right? We'll get to those next quarter when I ask a full research paper out of you. All right. If you have questions, comments, or issues about the exegetical assignment, I'll be glad to take those in email or after class or in between classes, whatever. Does anyone have a general question about that assignment? Fairly straightforward. Difficult, I grant you, right? I didn't take that away from it, but it should be as straightforward as I can make it. Yeah, so if you want me to look at drafts, you have questions about your started, a paragraph, all that kind of stuff, fragments, I'll be glad to look at any and all of that. Right? So the earlier you send it to me, the better I'll have a chance to react to it. So please take that into account as well. Okay. All right, questions, issues, or problems from last time, things you want to come back to, things you want to talk about? It's all crystal clear. It can't all be possibly crystal clear. All right, so let's walk our way through this recitation, if you want to call it that, overview of the argument of the master argument of the objective logic, and see if that doesn't provoke some questions in you, some things you're unclear about how the train of argumentation, the train of analysis actually works. I think the main thing to get out of the objective logic, before we look at the actual details of how the argument works, is that at this point, where we've reached, the actuality chapter, right, this final section of the objective logic, is really Hegel saying at this point, he's saying, look, here's what we've been able to show about the nature of reality. And what we've been able to show about the nature of reality is that it's thoroughgoingly relational. It's thoroughgoingly relational. If you've got nothing else out of this, he's arguing that. He's arguing that being's relational, essence is relational, they're relational to one another. Nothing is on its own. Everything is inherently and necessarily, not just accidentally and contingently, but necessarily tied up with everything else. How it's tied up with it, yes, we've got to explore that, but that is the claim he's making, that relationality is the name of the game in terms of the ontology of the nature of the reality as we have here. Now, we've seen a pattern in Hegel's argumentation. We're going to see it again here in this final section as well, in the final discussion here about actuality. We'll see it will ultimately propel us into the logic of the concept, right? So we'll be headed that way at that point. But here's the pattern of argument we've been seeing repeatedly. So nothing new, terribly new in this. We've said repeatedly that Hegel will show, look, here's a concept. Doesn't matter if it's quality, quantity, measure, whatever the concept is. He will say, here's this concept. And if we'll just focus in on what that concept is, we'll see that it necessarily mutates. It necessarily, of itself, changes. Right? It, to use technical language, negates itself. It others itself. It transforms itself. We don't do it to it. Right? It does it to itself. And that transforms it into something other than it. So some other concept. So quality transforms into quantity, quantity and quality transform into measure. We know the sort of legacy of this. But then he says, well, that transformation, the other into which it's transformed, brings that thing to be what it is, right? So quality comes to be only insofar as it's quantity in some sense. Quantity comes to be only insofar as it's quality. That's what the name measure really is trying to capture, so forth and so on from there. So a category then entails another category of itself, a transformation of itself, it others itself. It negates itself into that other category. That other category then is the negation of it, and by virtue of that negational relation between the two, the first one and the second one come to be what they are. So they're mutually implicative of one another. They're mutually implicative of one another. So they are then, it turns out, relata of a relation, where that relation is not extrinsic, something they happen to be involved in, something they come into relationship through, but necessary. One is what it is only by virtue, through its relationship to the other. That's true on either side of the relata. Either side of the relata. So relationality is more fundamental than the relata themselves. We could say that. The relation is what makes them what they are. But we also know, so here's the stages we've been through several times. The relata entail a relation, but the relation, it turns out, actually entails a process. The process is what generates the relation and the relata. So you could just say from that level, right, from this very abstract view, that what Hegel's showing in the logic about the nature of reality is that it's full on, everything is relational. But that relationality of all things, that all things necessarily entail everything else, that relationality of all things is generated by, produced by some kind of process. Some kind of process. Now we've seen that recur throughout the logic. We saw it all the way back in qualitative infinity, we saw it in quantitative infinity. Those are, we know, infinity now is not the non-finite finite, right? The non-finite infinite, right? It is actually a process, infinitizing. We know the same thing's true about measure, that it reflects back into essence, that essence is necessarily self-contradictory, so it entails, reflects itself, appears in being. We know this sort of story, we're about to rehearse it again in just a moment. So we know this kind of, this procedure, this pattern of moving from the category to its relata, to the relation, to the process that generates the relation. But here's what we come up against every time. And we're about to come up against it again in the ultimate fundamental way here in the actuality chapter. It's this. We've been to this moment of process repeatedly, right? You can say since page 2, right? Because becoming is a process. So being, nothing, becoming, right. So we're constantly being shown, demonstrated, that you can't have one without the other, but to have either one of them requires the relationality, but the relationality itself is engendered by something more fundamental than it, namely this process. Great, wonderful. Then we ask this simple but all important question, okay, what's the structure, what's the logic, what's the nature of that process? What's the law governance of that process? It's not an arbitrary process that just does what it wants to, whenever it wants to do it, chaotically and arbitrarily. It does it under certain kind of structure, certain kind of rules. It's intelligible in that sense. Yes, Izzy? Well then, what is the structure of that? And every time we've brought up that question and tried to answer it in the objective logic, every time we've had to fall back on relational structures. So all throughout the logic of being, we've said repeatedly, look, there's a process that gives rise to quality, quantity, and measure. Wonderful, great. What's that process? Well, it's this process of infinitizing on the qualitative side, infinitizing on the quantitative side, infinitizing in measures, the nodal line, right? And there we find another kind of infinitizing going on there, right? Well, what's the structure of that? Well, every time we want to talk about that in the logic of being, we said, oh, well, it becomes other than itself, or it becomes other than itself in order to become itself. But notice, that's still relational. It becomes other. Its relationship to its other, and its relationship to its other is its relationship to itself. Okay. So the structure of the process is a relational logic. Yeah, Hegel said. At this stage, absolutely, that's all we can say about it. In the logic of essence, we say, oh, well, look, things have changed here. It's not just being with non-being anymore. Right? Now the non-being, the negational nature of reality, is actually inherent in being itself, in essence itself. Well, that means they reflect themselves out of themselves. So the process there is not infinity, it's reflection. Well, okay, then what's the structure of reflection? Well, Hegel says it's about positing, it's about extrinsicality, extrinsic reflection, it's about determining reflection. But notice again, that's all done in still relational terms. Reflection out of itself, reflection into itself. What is determinate reflection? The combination of those two moments of reflecting out of itself, othering itself, and then reflecting back into itself, having self-identity back into itself. It's still a relational account of the process. Why am I emphasizing this? Because throughout the objective logic, we have never gotten an account of process that's not relational. We've never gotten an account of process, the process is generative of all relations, that wasn't itself cashed out in terms of relationality, a relational logic itself. That at least makes some sense to everyone? Now the reason why I want to press that point today is Hegel on the last 3 pages of the objective logic is going to say, we'll look at this in more detail next quarter, but just so you know what the concept logic at least starts to be about at that point, is he says, okay, look, if you look at the nature of the modality of manifestation, and you look at the causality of manifestation, then what you're going to see is there's a logic there to that process, the process of manifestation. And that logic is going to initially look relational. It's going to look like the relation between, possibility and actuality, cause and effect, substance, accident, those sorts of things. But when we push those through to their end, that logic won't ultimately be merely relational. There'll be an account there, the beginnings of an account there, that will be a processional logic that won't be relational. Hegel will say at that point, now we're talking about the process on its own terms, not through the objective logic's relational ontology. We're talking about the process that generates all relations and all relata, but not in terms of relations themselves. We're talking about it in a processional logic itself. That's what the concept denotes. So when Hegel says on those last 3 pages, we're now not talking about being or essence anymore. We're talking about the process that generates both of them, which in a certain sense, we've always been talking about. That's what becoming was. But we've always been talking about it in terms of relational logic. Now we're going to be able to talk about it on its own terms, because now we've been able to demonstrate what those terms would really be. And what those terms would really be, he lays out on the last page of the objective logic, would be universality, particularity, and individuality, which is not a relational logic. It's not one thing related to another. Its universality entails particularization. Particularization is a process for Hegel. And that will entail a culmination, individuality. But that's the logic of the concept. And that's supposed to be an account of the process, the concept itself, without it being reduced or accessed through the relational logic that we've been studying in the rest of the objective logic. It's what makes all that possible, but it's not it itself. So now we've finally got an account in those last few pages. We get an account, and then we'll explore it all in the doctrine of the concept, right? That's what the subjective logic is about. We can now spell out what that logic would actually be, how it actually works, what's the logic of the process by which everything else is generated. Make a little bit of sense in terms of division of labor, so to speak, right? What goes on in the objective logic is the demonstration of a relational ontology, which is completely and wholly dependent on a process. We want an account of that process on its own terms. We never get it in the objective logic, except for the last moment where we talk about the modality of manifestation, the causality of manifestation, both of which bear in common this feature by which they are self-generative. Self-generative. Because they're self-generative, Hegel says, then we rightly call that freedom. To be self-caused is to be free. No, where do you get a crazy idea like that? Kant. Right? Kant said, when we talk about freedom, we need to distinguish between 2 kinds of freedom. Right? This is in the antinomies in the first critique. Kant says we need to distinguish between 2 kinds of freedom. We need to talk about human freedom, which he calls practical freedom. And human freedom, practical freedom, is always conditioned. Right? Always conditioned. Right? We never are purely spontaneous. We don't get to do things, and the act of our will doesn't get to be purely spontaneous. It gets to do things only under certain conditions, certain compulsions, certain motivations, certain empirical and other kinds of conditions. But to make sense of that, Kant famously says, we need to distinguish that from pure spontaneity. Pure spontaneity. Clearly, this is the comparative that Kant oftentimes makes between human freedom, practical freedom, and divine freedom, or what he calls in the first critique, transcendental freedom. And transcendental freedom, he says, no big surprise here, is self-causing. It's pure spontaneity. It has no conditions. So when you see at the end of the objective logic, Hegel starts talking about freedom, he's not talking about freedom of the will. He's not talking about freedom of my will, your will, or any other kind of will. He's talking about freedom in terms of a process that's purely self-causative, purely self-generative. Okay, what would that be? Right? That would be the question we all have, and that's the question he's trying to address in the doctrine of the concept. It's objective logic. Make a little bit of sense? A lot more to be unpacked there, obviously, but I wanted to at least talk about how this sets up that discussion. Then let's look at the overarching argument of the objective logic. Here I'm just trying to reconstruct it. Again, I don't think this is faithful to every nook and cranny of what goes on in the text itself, but it gets the main argument as it's working through both the doctrine of being and the doctrine of essence to get to these conclusions, these 2 conclusions here at the end, and we'll take off from the second conclusion or the 4th conclusion. So let's just walk our way through this for a moment. So to be is to be qualitatively and quantitatively determined. One of the central messages, right, of the doctrine of being. To be is what? To be qualitatively determined. That means to exist, to be real in some sense. It doesn't mean to have qualities. Right? Let's go back and remind ourselves it doesn't mean to have a certain kind of color, or a certain kind of shade, or a certain kind of taste. Not those secondary qualities. Not even the primary qualities of mass and weight. None of that kind of stuff. We're talking about here just the simple quality of existing. reality itself. So it has to be real, but it also has to be quantitatively determined. What's that? It means it's discrete. It's discrete. So now we can talk about to be is to be an entity. Right? To be real, to be an entity. So to be discrete is to be an entity, to be is to be an entity. Second, to be qualitatively and quantitatively determined, that is to be an entity, is made possible by the reciprocal determination, the measure setting, the boundary setting, of each qualitative and quantitative determination by the other. That's what we mean by measure. So you can't be without being measured. Your qualitative determination, that is your reality, sets the boundaries for your quantitative determination, that is the discreteness. We know both of those are caught up in their own kinds of infinitizing movements, and we see them in relationship to one another in measure. That's what the nodal line was. So, but the reciprocal determination of quality and quantity of one another is itself necessarily dependent on, so here's the move from the doctrine of being into the doctrine of essence, it's dependent on the more fundamental stratum of essence to set the boundaries of or to measure qualitative and quantitative being. Remember his argument at the end of the doctrine of being was that quality and quantity are trying to set the measure on the nodal line, but that will go on into infinity one way or the infinity the other way. The only thing that can set the boundaries on the nodal line itself is something that's not a participant in the nodal line, something that's a substrate that undergirds it, underlies it, and then bears those changes as it states. Well, that turns out to be essence. So now we have not a transition from quality to quantity or quantity to quality. We have here a reflection back into essence itself. The truth of being is essence, he says. So that truth of location, right, we've come up with this many times now. What does it mean? It means when you think being through, or what being is in its truth, what it is in its reality, is essence. That's what that claim means, right? The truth of it follows from it, right? That's what it means. And that means it's what makes that possible. So this is that notion of the immanent unfolding of the categories by virtue of negation. And what does that entail? It entails their truth, which turns out to be something that followed from them. But that means the result is the truth. The result then is the ground. Here's the retrospective notion, the regressing back into the ground. So the truth of being is essence. Now we explore the essence logic. The being logic make a little bit of sense? Torturous when you're going through it, right? So if you found it torturous, yes, it is torturous. I just want to confirm that for everybody. But those are the minimal claims there, right? So all the torture, right, is wrapping around those claims. Those are hard to make, but that's the claims he's making. To do that, to unpack that imminently. You can set them out like this, no problem, right? But to show how they actually flow from one another, that's the torture, that's earning the claims. So the truth of being is essence. Okay, great. The relating of being to essence and essence to being is the movement of reflection. So reflection becomes the name then for, is the name that designates that relation between essence and being, but also the process, right? It's an activity. Reflection is, remember, an activity, of, as he says, a movement of being, not a movement of consciousness, but a movement of being itself. Reflection posits being as shine by setting in place essence as the depth by which being is constituted as qualitatively and quantitatively determinate. So the initial setup of the logic of essence is to say, look, essence is the depth, being is the surface shine, and being reflects itself back into, tethers itself back to that depth, and that depth shines through, right, into the shining, shimmering guise of being itself, and gives it qualitative and quantitative measure and determination. But as we began to explore essence on its own terms, right, when we look at what an essence or essentiality is itself, what do we find? It's inherently self-contradictory. As we've seen, I've come back to this several times, Hegel comes back to it again in the actuality chapters we noted last time, that to claim that an essence is self-contradictory means two things. It's null and void, and it others itself. It's null and void unto itself, it destroys itself. There is nothing to essence itself. Here's the collapse, right, the falling apart of essence unto itself. It's null and void. There is nothing to essence. There is no in itself of essence. There is only it's for itself. It's othering of itself, right? It reflects out of itself. So contradiction means both of those things. Not only that it collapses in on itself. There is no identity to talk about there. There's nothing there. But it others itself in that collapsing. And that othering of itself is what gives rise to being. So essence is the appearance of itself, right? It appears now. It doesn't just reflect itself. It doesn't just shine. It air shine. I mean, it appears in being itself and appears as its ground. Now that's a funny thing to say about it, right? Because we just said, well, it's that which being is tethered to. It's that which everything about that we see around us that appears. It's that which it's appearing of. It's the appearing of that ground. But the ground has nothing unto itself. So that little kernel of there's nothing in itself about essence persists. It never goes away. It's always there. It means that essence can't be anything other than some feature of being itself. So as we've seen, right, this claim about since essence is inherently self-contradiction, essence is ground as a condition of mediation. But if essence is ground as a condition of mediation, then whenever all the conditions obtained, the matter arises, then essence must appear, it must show itself in being. But essence of being are necessarily unrelated through appearance. So appearance now is the name, replacing becoming, replacing transition, replacing reflection. Now we're to appearance itself. Their relation is nothing other than the movement of essence appearing as the condition, the grounding condition for all that is. But here's the pivotal move here, step 11. The grounding condition, we talked about this several times over the last couple of sessions. The grounding condition, essence as the thing, the world in itself, the world, the whole, the force, the inner. And that which grounds concrete existence, being, properties, world of appearance, parts, expression, outer, they prove to be moments of one totality. Or to state it in a negative form, essence is nothing unto itself, it just is what it is in its appearance. So if it's nothing unto itself, if the thing, right, the thing, the world in itself, the whole, the force, the inner, is nothing unto itself, it just is whatever its othering is, whatever its expression is. Force is its expression, whole is its part, thing is its property, so forth. Then what does that mean? It means that there is nothing other than that process of othering itself, that process of now not just appearing, because appearing is the appearing of the ground. But now the ground doesn't have anything unto itself. That's what is borne out by this essential relation. What does that leave us then with? That actuality is the unity of essence and concrete existence. Now, if that makes some sense, a lot to remind ourselves there, but that's the trajectory of the entirety of the objective logic as best I can reconstruct it in one sheet. Questions about that? Make some sense? Because now I just want to add one thing to that. That's the final conclusion here. Make some sense? So that's easy to get lost in. That's a lot of weeds, that's a lot of trees to get lost in, absolutely. But I think it helps us, may help us, and I think it does help us, to go back and reconstruct that pathway to see how we got to where we're at. So here's what Hegel wants to do. He wants to say, okay, look, actuality names initially, it names the unity of being and essence, where they are on the same plane. One's not the depth and the other is the surface. One's not the ground and the other is the grounded. They're both moments of one thing, let's say it broadly initially, called actuality. And that's all there is. That's all there is. Now, at the end of his discussion of the essential relation, he says, if there's nothing to the ground side other than what appears on the appearance side, then all we really have at this moment is just this moment of, he gives it several names, appearing, expressing, revealing, and then the final name he wants to use for it, manifesting. Now look, if you don't get anything else out of the objective logic, I think you've got to get this or you don't get Hegel. Right? So it's that momentous. Here's the claim. And it's perplexing, right? So let's stay with it for a moment, try to make sense of it. When we talk about it, let's distinguish between appearance and manifestation. When you talk about appearance, you're talking about the appearance of the ground, right? You're talking about the appearance of the thing and its properties, you're talking about the appearance of the world in itself and the world of appearance, so forth and so on. Everybody good? So when we talk about appearance, we're talking about the appearance of something. It's supposed to be the appearance of the ground, but there is no ground other than the grounded. So really what you're pointing back to is not one side or the other side, you're pointing back to the process itself, the process of expressing. Right? That's all you really have. But we want to immediately ask, okay, what's being expressed? What is revealing itself? What is manifesting itself? And normally, right, our standard metaphysical heritage, the traditional account of that would say, there's something that's being revealed, there's something that's being expressed, there's something that's being manifested. God, humanity, nature, essences, whatever. There's a whole set of candidates for what's being revealed, what's being manifested, what's being expressed. And Hegel's claim is that we've already been down that road. There is nothing to essence. It's void, vacuous, null unto itself, because it's inherently contradictory. And so because it's inherently contradictory, there's nothing unto itself. It only is its othering of itself, its externality, its externalization, as Hegel will put it. Then really all we have is the process. So what is expressing itself? What is manifesting itself? What is revealing itself? What's being revealed, what's being manifested is just the process of revealing and manifesting itself. That's it. There's no agent. There's no thing that's being revealed. Now look, I know the standard portrayal of Hegel, so let's just step back for a moment and remind ourselves, right? The standard portrayal of Hegel, one standard portrayal, sort of an old one now, is to say, oh, look, when he's talking about this, he really means God, right? He calls it Geist, I mean, it's spirit, so right there, it's like, secret little whisper, it's the Holy Spirit, we all know that, right? So it's God, right? And that's what's being manifested, God's manifesting. God's revealing, right? God's expressing. Okay, we learned that cosmic entity thing is a bit much, right? So, okay, that's not the right way to understand Hegel, fine. Then what is it? It's us, right? It's humanity that's doing this. I mean, it's the subject, writ large, not you, me, but subjectivity as such. The transcendental unity of apperceptions as kind, or whatever else we're going to call it, the mind, or mindedness, as we like to say now. That's what's being revealed here. That's what's being displayed. That's what's being exhibited. And Hegel wants to reject every last one of those because the only thing that's being revealed by manifestation is manifestation. The process is a revealing of itself as process. Now, we want to say, well, who's the doer of the deed? Who's the agent of the expression? Who's the agent of the manifestation? Who's the one being revealed and doing the revelation? And Hegel wants to say, we're not entitled to any of that stuff. I know what we have traditionally answered that question by, I get that, says Hegel, but we're not entitled to any of those claims. In fact, if anything, we've undermined any of those claims, the possibility of any of those claims. So a divine answered that question? A finite human being answered that question? So the theological answer to the question or the anthropological answer to the question? Neither one of them are going to work because Hegel is, as I've said before, a process metaphysician, where the process doesn't have a doer. It just is. So when he talks about manifestation, he constantly reminds you that manifestation manifests itself, and that's it. It's a process disclosing, revealing, showing, exhibiting itself, and that's all it is. And you want to say, well, what is that? And Hegel will say, everything around you and you included. All of us are caught up in that process of manifestation. It's not going on someplace else. There is no someplace else. Right? There is just actuality. Okay, let's be clear. Hegel doesn't mean by actuality every little jot and tittle that's sitting around in front of you. That he calls existence. We've already been here, right? So we know what existence is. Everything that is contingent, that could be otherwise, is a feature of the domain we call existence. But born within that is actuality. And actuality is this process that's going on right now all around us, and is by virtue of it, everything is what it is and is at all. So I know we find this incredibly frustrating about Hegel. This is what he's saying. If you want to know where manifestation is occurring, everything that is manifestation. Everything that exists in any mode in which it exists is a moment within that process of manifestation. We're all caught up in that process of manifestation. Everything that exists is a moment in the process of manifestation. And furthermore, everything that could exist is born as a real possibility within states of affairs that either obtain now, or have obtained in the past, or will obtain in the future. is no transcendent realm. This is Hegel saying, look, all there is, literally everything that is immanent. But that doesn't mean that everything just is as it is right in front of you. It means there's a process going on. So, as he says in this last quote here, this is page 478, 381 in the German, the actual is therefore manifestation. The actual is therefore manifestation. It is not drawn into the sphere of alteration by its externality. That's how literally all of the logic of being operated, right? Being with negation, being with non-being. It was drawn out every time we had something, right? Something couldn't be itself because it was always, beholden to its otherness. So it was drawn out beyond itself and thereby changed, altered continually because it was beset by negation. It was beset by its own otherness. Well, he's saying that's not really how it works here. This is not being with non-being. The truth of being with non-being is something deeper than that. What's that? He says, nor is it the shining of itself in another. Here's how the logic of essence has worked up to this point, right? Every last bit of the logic of essence has worked insofar as we've talked about reflection, the shining of one into the other. So what is being? Being is that which is tethered back on, reflected back into essence. What is essence? That which is reflected into its other being. So they are reflected into or shining into another. And he's saying, at the end of the day, the truth of both of those modes of relation, being with non-being, being that is inherently non-being, logic of being is being with non-being, logic of essence is being with non-being included within it. He says the truth of both of those is rather, he says, it manifests itself. And stop there, you want to say, okay, what's the it? That's what we're talking about, right? What's the it? God, human, something else, right? What's the it? Which means that in its externality, it is itself, and here's the kicker, and only in it. Only in what? Its externality. That's the lesson of the objective logic. There's no ground. There's no essence that lies underneath all of existence, that murky, dark, shadowy place that we go to outside the cave in Plato or wherever else it might be, right? It's not beyond. It's within everything. It's in the process itself, in its externality. He says it is itself. In its externality, it is itself. It doesn't transition over into something. There's no being that transitions over into something. There's no essence or being that reflects back into something. It is itself in its externality, and only it is. That is to say, so now what's that mean? To say it is its externality. It is itself only as, and this is all there is, right? Here's the process. Self-differentiating and self-determining movement. Now that's about as straightforward a declaration from Hegel as I can imagine to say, look, the nature of reality is processional. It's processed all the way down. Everything's in thoroughgoing relation with one another. Everything's are moments of this process, so they're relata, necessarily inherently related to one another. Yes. Full-going relational ontology. As we're about to see, there is no actuality without possibility. There is no effect without a cause. All of that's necessarily intertwined with one another. But at the end of the day, at the end of those claims, what's there? The movement of manifestation itself. And what is that? Nothing other than self-differentiating and self-determining movement. The other name for that, of course, is determinate negation. So what looked like it was initially, in the logic of being, something that being was afflicted with. You got reality and damn it comes along with negation every time, and that disturbs it, undermines it. And in the logic of essence, you get being, but yeah, it reflects back into essence, and oh damn, you can't have essence without being, so you're mutually implicative of one another, mutually necessary, dependent on one another, okay, fine. So, but that's the reflective relationship, but that's because each one of them has negativity built into them. Now the third step along that pathway, that's because reality has negation, essence and being have reflection, negation built into them. Because why? Because that's the fundamental nature of reality. It is that process of manifesting that is self-differentiating, self-determining. Now we immediately want to say, okay, Hegel, if that's the bottom of all things, if that's, to use this term very loosely, the ground of all things, it's not a ground like we normally understand it, right? But if that's the foundation, it's not a foundation of all things, then what is its logic? And Hegel says, right, we need to give an account of that logic on its own terms, not in relational terms. But we're going to start off by still giving it in relational terms. All right. That's roughly where we were at last time, beginning of class last time, talk about modality, causality from there. Questions about that pathway up to that point? Makes some sense? Pretty preposterous, yes, but at least some sense to be, can follow it, is all I mean by that. You don't have to agree with it. I assume most of us are going, I don't think that's right, but I don't know why it's wrong, right? Yeah, I mean, that's, even when you get clear about, I mean, it's hard enough just to read the text, right? Let's always start back from that. It's hard enough just to read the text and go, he's claiming this, he's claiming that, right? But as you move along the way, you start to see, okay, well, I can start to get a little bit of this. These summary passages start to give me a little light into that shadowy murky text. And it starts to look something like this. But then you want to go, okay, I'm starting to get the picture of reality that Hegel's proposing, right? Proposing is not quite the right word, because he's saying, here's the nature of reality, because this is what the nature of reality entails itself to be, right? So this isn't just my best guess, right? Which is what proposal sounds like. But for the moment, let's talk about, here's his picture of reality. But then you want to go, something messed up about that, something wrong. You ought to have some kind of impression that to claim that everything is part of a process of manifestation sounds intriguing, but also not enough to give us an account of stuff like, how does identity persist? The basic problems of metaphysics, right? How do things persist? How do they remain what they are? How do they undergo change? Well, okay, they undergo change because they're beset by negation, but how do they ever get stabilized? I mean, that's kind of the problem here, right? This is the kind of Heraclitean reset, right? We always look at Heraclitus and go, that's amazing. But how would anything ever be if everything is becoming? If the river flows, where's the stops, right? Where's the bridge? How do we ever get the step? In that kind of stuff, right? It doesn't make sense. That becomes the problems, right? All the stuff that seems to be undermined by this flow, this process. And so Hegel, we've got to have an answer for those questions, because the world is a world of interrelation. Okay, I'll buy that. It's a world of process. Okay, I'll buy that. But then how does it actually generate stabilities? And then those are interrelated to how does it do this? Right? What's its logic? To put it back in those terms again. Questions about that issue, problems? Right, then let me see if I can set up what goes on in this last chapter, right? So this last section we've been talking about both last time and today is about this question of actuality itself, right? And I think the best way to read that is to talk about manifestation. I said this last time, I just want to sketch it out a little bit here. Talk about manifestation, which we just said is the process of actuality itself, right? And we should talk about it in terms of its modality and its causality. This way of portraying is a bit artificial, right? Hegel doesn't quite set it up this way, but I think there's enough in what he does say to think about this as the form of manifestation, how it manifests. And this is the what of manifestation, so this is the content, of manifestation. What is manifested? So I think it's helpful to think about it in those terms. Modality is about the relationship between possibility and actuality. Or as we can still see it here, essence and being. Where that relationship has two dimensions, right? We can talk about it in terms of necessity and contingency. We know there's several different kinds of necessity, several different kinds of contingency, several different kinds accordingly of possibility and actuality. I'll walk us back through those in just a moment. But that's the nature of that relationality. Hegel's going to argue, right, that we can't think possibility without actuality. Why? Strangely, because, remember this, that moment where he says, because possibility is self-contradictory. Well, that should tell you fairly flat out. I mean, I know it's 300 pages back from where we are at when he says that, but that's him basically rehearsing the argument about the identity of essentiality, the identity of essences, and saying, look, here we are back again to that same problem at a different dimension now. We're talking about it in a modal sense rather than an identity problem. Right? Essentiality, we talked about it in terms of identity. But possibility is inherently self-contradictory. It is itself, but it's not itself. A possibility is only itself by not being itself. What does that mean? By not being itself means it's actual in some sense. Possibility only makes sense when it's a here's the term he uses for it, not a formal possibility, not just merely non-contradictory, that's what a formal possibility is. But it's possible in terms of could be. It's a real possibility at that point. That means it could be actual. But that means that it's already born within actuality itself. There is some state of affairs that bears that possibility within it. Well, notice that's Hegel literally telling you to talk about an essence is to talk about nothing other than a set of real possibilities that are existing within some state of affairs. That's all essences are. That's what a speculative understanding of essence would have to be, a real possibility. The real actuality, of course, is what it actually becomes. It's when that real possibility is actualized, or when, as he says, the totality of the conditions are present, then the fact necessarily follows from it. So here we have actualization, if you want to put it in those terms. And then when you use that term, Hegel uses that term very little, actually, actualization. But when we use that term, we say, oh, okay. The game's up. I know what's going on here, right? This is Aristotle. That's all that's happening. This is just, warmed over, modern day, post-Kantian Aristotle. I'll submit to you that it's not that, right? Because how does actualization work in Aristotle? Actualization works in Aristotle by what? The formal cause brings about the final cause. It's driving it all the way through. It's what shapes and molds the actualization. There's nothing like that here. Real possibilities are just that, real possibilities. They don't have any kind of destinal plan, blueprint, governing the process of actualization itself. That isn't Aristotle. That's why he says when the totality of conditions are present, not when the plan's in place. When the totality of conditions are present, then the fact follows, then actuality follows from it. So that's real necessity, right? When you hear real, as I've said many times last time, think relative, right? So this is where the necessity is, if you have the full set of conditions in place, then relative to that, you will get the actuality that flows out of that. So it's necessary relative to the totality of those conditions being in place. But that means it's dependent on, it's contingent here, not in the sense of it just could be otherwise. That's the formal sense of contingency. But here, real contingency is dependent on, right? The actual is dependent on the possible. All that's by way of summary of what we did last time. Make a little bit of sense? Handout I gave you last time talks more about this, some more detail. Yeah, Nick.
What has allowed us from manifestation to make this split between content, and then from modality, what has allowed us to make this split of possibility?
Yeah, so Hegel will say, look, if we're going to talk about the absolute as manifestation, if this is the absolute, then we can just talk about the absolute into itself. But if we talk about the absolute into itself, it has no differentiation. Then it's formless and void and has no determination unto itself. But it does have, then, doesn't it, this process that's going on, manifestation itself. Well, the manifestation is its mode, and this is its absolute, right? So the absolute has a mode. So this notion of mode, its way of being, he calls it its how and its way, right? Then gets you to modality. And he says, okay, what's the modalities in which it could be? How could it be? Well, it could be actual, it could be possible, and then it could have the relationship between the two, necessity and contingency. So that's roughly how he gets to those categories, invokes the modal categories. Causality will come directly out of that. That's why I said this is a bit of an artificial divide here, because he doesn't literally portray it this way. He goes to modality and says modality entails what's going to come from here, which is substance causality in this process. You want to come back to that?
I guess the confusion that I was having was more on the split from how we are able to actually say possibility without falling back into something that isn't the unity of essence and being. But I guess I'm thinking about it a lot like all the way back in the doctrine of being with Dasein, it's unity of being and non-being, but then we're able to still go somewhere by difference between Dasein and quality, which one's focus. So
yes. So I think that the formal determination of the categories of modality, the formal sense of possibility, actuality, necessity, and contingency, is that first section about the formal determination of those, or ways of thinking about it purely as here's essence, here's being separate from one another, again, right? Going back to that moment. And say, let's think about them just as pure essence and pure being. Well, what would you get then? You would get a formal sense of possibility, you get a formal sense of actuality on the being side, you get a formal sense of possibility on the essence side, and you get a formal sense of necessity and contingency in the relationship between them. But if they really are one, then those can't possibly be what they are. They can be formal determinations of it, right? So you can still specify it this way, and they're extractable to exist that way, but that's not their truth. Their truth is they're real, and that means they're relational, because essence and being are one. So these have to have some kind of relationality. So I think about it this way. Hegel's claim that the absolute means the unity of essence and being. But it's an empty, vacuous unity if it doesn't have determination to it. And what both modality and causality give is the determination that's inherent within the absolute itself. It is the absolute itself. Is that useful?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So far so good? Questions about this? Make some sense? All right. So we talked about this last time. Let's just walk our way through this just for the sake of the diagram to talk about those in that way. And we'll come back and talk about it in more detail textually in just a second. Let me get this. Cancels that out. All right, so then he says, well, look, if these two moments are necessarily dependent on one another, if the relata form a relation, the relation we can name as necessity, but also as contingency, if that's what we mean by the real determinations of possibility, the real determinations of necessity, the real determination of actuality, the real determinations of both necessity and contingency. Then he says, and this is that final bit that we'll come back to in just a little bit to talk about again. Then if that's the case, then necessity and contingency name not the relation between possibility and actuality, but they are the process that generates actuality and possibility. Necessity and contingency both name the process. So necessity is contingency is necessity. And he doesn't mean that in some sort of cute little, they're separable from one another, but they're really the same thing. He says they're the same thing because they're both the same process. They're named for the same process. And we can see that already here, right? Necessity, real necessity. Real contingency. It's just two names for this relation, right? So necessity in the sense of how do you get actuality? The actualization, to use that term, of the real possibilities within prior states of affairs, antecedent state of affairs. Well, what does that create then? It means this actuality is dependent on, it's contingent on that possibility. It is what it is by virtue of those. Well, if that's the case, if that's the relation, then when we actually look at this more closely, we see, well, where'd you get possibility and actuality from? Where did those states of affairs come from? They came from this process that generates that relation. Well, what's the process? Well, the process is not necessity on one side and contingency on the other side. It is actually necessity and contingency being thought together there as the same damn thing. That's the argument we saw him make last week. That's the modal argument about manifestation. So manifestation is a process. It's a necessary process and a contingent process. It has real necessity, real contingency, but it also has what he calls absolute necessity and absolute contingency. And absolute necessity and absolute contingency are nothing other than generative negation. Generative negation. Why? Because when actuality comes to be out of possibility, what is it doing? It's negating the possible and realizing it in some actuality. But it comes to be that by incorporating that possibility within itself. That is what it is. So it's negated that possibility, made it actual, but in becoming actual, it's come to be what it is. It's both negated it as possible, but realized it as actual. There's this generative process of negation. There's determinate negation at work. And that is both what establishes that it follows from it, the necessity, but also that it's dependent on it, the contingency. So the contingency and necessity both name the work of, the operation of, the process of determinate negation. Make some sense? Large pill to swallow? But that is the key, right? So I always think about this, right? Up to the moment of where he's talking about absolute necessity and absolute contingency, makes some sense, right? Relationally, this all makes some sense. You don't get actuality without possibility. You don't get possibility without actuality. Okay, fine. There are no, there are only real possibilities. That's all there really are. They're only real possibilities. And to be real possibilities, they ultimately have to be, in some form, fashion, or another, actualized. They can't be without being actual. So, in that sense, possibility and actuality inherently tied up with one another. So, yeah, for anything to be, it necessarily followed from in some situation that it was possible that it be. Okay, great, that's the necessity side. And that means also that whatever is dependent on that possibility having pre-existed, having been antecedent to it. So it's contingent upon that, it's dependent upon. Okay, fine. So the modal nature of the relations makes some sense. The difficult pill to swallow is for him then to say, okay, the relation is produced by a process. And that's kind of the gnawing bit there, right? Because you want to say, okay, well, the relation was about possibility becoming actual. Because it becomes actual, it then has this necessary entailment, right? It becomes, the actualization is the necessary following from those those totality of conditions being in place, obtaining in a prior state of affairs. Okay, fine. And that makes it dependent on that prior state of affairs. Okay, fine. But that's all relational language. But underlying that, notice, is all this process language. Becoming actual. What did that? Nothing in the possible did that. Nothing in the actual did that. Nothing in the two relata generated that relation. Well, what did it then? Some process that generates both of them. This has always been the dilemma, right? We always come up to saying, well, there's these categories, one category of possibility entails another category and transforms itself into another category, actuality. They're relata, they're mutually implicative of one another, so they bear a relation. Well, what's that relation? Real necessity, real contingency. Great, wonderful, fine, let's stop. We can't say, well, why? We have to account for why there are these things in this relation and the relation itself. That takes us to the process level. Well, that means we have to then think of this as absolute necessity, which is just absolute contingency, both of which are just absolute, as he says in that passage, negativity. So notice what that means. What is manifestation? What is the absolute? It's this process. Well, how is it this process? Well, it's a process of going from the possible to the actual. Okay, fine. And that means the possible and the actual are necessarily dependent on one another. Right. It means that you can't have possibility without actuality. You can't have actuality without possibility. One way in which they relate is through necessity. Right? Actuality is the actualization of the possibility. And that means that they relate in terms of contingency. The actual is always dependent on the possible. You say, well, that's the relationality of the manifestation. That's the two sides of the manifestation. What's showing up, what's showing itself, what's revealing itself is in actuality. But it's not the actual. Right? What's showing itself is the process. I mean, we look at the table, we look at the chair, we look at each other, and we think, that's all there is. And Hegel's saying, no, that's the tip of the iceberg. That's the actuality, that's the realization of some possibility, some real possibility. Oh, okay, well then that's relational. Right, but how did that happen? The problem of Genesis, the generative process keeps coming back. How did that get engendered? How did that get produced? How did that get, to use his technical language for it, taken over from Fichte, how did that get posited? How did that get posited? How did that get produced? How did that get set forth? Well, that's this move to absolute necessity, just is absolute contingency, because both of them are absolute generative negativity. That's how this works. So what is manifestation in terms of how it happens? It happens through this process of absolute negativity, generating, or other names for it is absolute contingency, absolute necessity. This is what makes you pull your hair out. All mine's already gone, that's what happened. Trying to figure this damn stuff out. This is him literally saying, you want to know how you get this relational ontology in terms of the modal status of these states of affairs? Doing that work. Now, at the end of that discussion, he makes two comments. Okay? He makes two comments. One is a limitation on what the modality has shown. And the other is an advancement that the discussion of modality has shown. The limitation first. He says, this process of absolute negativity, which is absolute contingency, absolute necessity, all of those are just three names for the same thing, and they're all, or it is, because it's all the name for the same thing, blind. He doesn't say a lot about it there, other than to say it's just the continual overturning Right? And here he goes back and takes language from being, nothing, becoming account. He says it's just possibility turning over into, right, literally passing over into actuality, and actuality turning over into possibility, because the new actuality is going to bear within itself other real possibilities that are going to give rise to further actuality. So it's just incessant overturning of one into the other. Well, that's like being falling into nothing, nothing falling into being, becoming one another. Becoming is this. Well, what he's telling you at that point is that's just becoming. What we got to with being, nothing, becoming, here's its deeper inner structure. Here's really what it is. Here's the truth of that. But it's blind. What does that mean? It has no direction. That's the way I read that. He doesn't say a lot about it there, but it's pretty clear that he's continually saying it's just one overturning into the other, overturning into the next, overturning to the next. This is a moment where he gets rhetorically flourish a little bit here. He'll say, everything that is already sent towards its death. Everything that is always ultimately going to be overturned. Nothing is forever. Now hear what that means, right? He's saying something that contradicts the tradition. Right? If you have something that necessarily is, in the classical sense of necessarily is, then it can't not be. But Hegel's saying what's necessary is that it not ultimately be. That's what's necessary. So it's always inherently sent to its own destruction, fated to fall apart. So it's blind. This doesn't have any directionality to it. It doesn't see where it's going. To me, this is Hegel raising the red flag and saying, I know this sounds like Aristotle, but the hell it is. Because there's no telos here. There's no teleological movement here. There's no final cause. There's no final causation. There's no final cause that's directing the whole process towards some destiny. This isn't an oak tree born out of some acorn. This is not. This is just the overturning of everything into something else. Without direction, without purpose, without goal, without telos of any kind. It's blind, precisely that point. Now we want to immediately ask, is that the end of the account? Does Hegel have process without teleology? So far, the answer to that question is yes. But we haven't finished the book. He's got a lot more to tell us about this process on its own terms. So let's leave that an open question. But he is telling you at this moment, there's nothing to warrant the introduction. Like that would be an intrusion, that would be an extrinsic intrusion, to say there's something that's directing this pathway, directing this process towards some destiny, towards some ultimate end, some ultimate goal. It's blind. Make a bit of sense? Then Hegel says, but there is an advance here. It's blind, but there is an advance here. What's the advance here? Advance is when we make it to absolute negativity, we see that absolute contingency, absolute necessity are nothing other than absolute necessity, right? Sorry, absolute negativity. Then what are we seeing? He says at that moment we see substantiality. Now what I've taken to mean at that point is to say, look, there's something that's occurring here. There's something that's happening that's not merely formal. We've been talking about we've been using modal categories thus far to talk about this process. And yeah, here's how it occurs. It occurs as absolute necessity, absolute contingency, absolute negativity. That's how it works. So when we're talking about this, it is itself only as self-differentiating and self-determining movement. That's the self-determining movement. When Hegel is saying we want to find the necessity in all things, this is what he's talking about. Not mechanical necessity, not mechanical causality. He's talking about this form of necessity, at least. But then having said that, he wants to say, but that's not just a formal matter, that's also about what's occurring as well. So now we switch from the form to the content. Now we're talking about something that is actually not just how this occurs, but what's occurring itself. We move from the form of it to its content, from its how it's happening, the modal natures of how it happens, to what's occurring. So now, in a sense, we've gone back to, okay, what is the absolute thing? We know how the absolute is. It is in its how, its modal structure, its modal nature is absolute negativity. But what is it? What's occurring in that process? What is it? And just to go back to this question, what shows itself? What is the absolute? What's showing itself? What is the content here? And he says, well, the name for that properly is substantiality, because it is that which bears accidents. Now, at that moment you want to go, thank you, right? Let's stop here. I don't need anything more to be said, right? Because now I got it. I understand it. This process is a process of substance expressing itself, manifesting itself, revealing itself in its actions. So what is the absolute? Substance. What does it display itself as? Accidents. Spinoza. I knew it. Right? It's not Aristotle. It's not Kant. Spinoza. We have a substance metaphysics finally. We can stop all our craziness about modality and settle in and just say, look, this is a substance metaphysics. At the basic of everything is a hypokaimenon that undergirds, underlies literally everything that exists. And it's all getting expressed out of that. And that's the absolute. I knew it. Hegel is a thinker of the absolute, and the thinker of the absolute is a think substance. So he is, it turns out, a Spinozist, corrupted Aristotelian, right? This is one way of reading Spinoza, right? Spinoza just took really seriously what Aristotle said about substance and said, there is just one substance, there can only be one substance. I know what Aristotle thought, he was nuts, but you know. That's our temptation, right? And Hegel immediately undermines that temptation. Literally immediately. He doesn't give you but 2 pages on substance and accidents. And by the second paragraph of that section, he's already telling you, yeah, that's the relation I want to talk about, substance to accidents. But the substance just is not, this will sound really familiar, the substance just is nothing other than its accidents. In fact, it's not just that it is its accidents, it is the production of those accidents. The production of those accidents. He calls it accidentality. I suggest you go look in Spinoza for that. Natura naturans, maybe? Maybe. So, substance gives rise to its accidents, its accidentality. He calls it actuosity at one point. He's making up words. Okay? Don't go looking for that. There's no place to find it other than in Hegel. Hegel's literally making up words to try to think about how this isn't a substance as you normally think about it. This is not the hypokaimenon. This is that which undergirds all other things. It's not. This thing is itself only in its accidentality. So it is here's what he does want to say about it. It is a power. A causal power. Macht is the German term. So what is revealed in the revealing? Nothing other than the revealing. What is revealed? What is manifested in manifesting? Nothing other than the manifesting. Well, what is the manifesting? A power is being manifested. A power of what? A power to give rise to accidents. Where the accidents are just moments within, but are what the substance is. There is nothing other than the accidents. There is no substance over and above them. This isn't the pincushion version of accidentality, right? There's not a pincushion that bears all the accidents within it. There is no pincushion. There is just, we've already been through this. There is no thing without properties. There is no force without its expression. Same thing's true about substance. But substance does give us this notion of power. And he says that means we must talk about it in terms of causality. So the moment that Hegel gives you substance, he insists that you think about substance, that substance must be thought of purely and wholly in terms not as merely the bearer, he uses this language, the bearer of accidents, but as that which engenders, that which posits, that which produces accident. In fact, it is nothing other than that process of producing accidents itself. It is accidentality, it's actuosity. That's his name for this production, this power that produces. And he says, at the end of the discussion of substance and accidents, he says substantiality, the relation of substantiality, as he calls it. He says, here we've reached absolute relation. Absolute relation. It's the title of the chapter, right? Absolute relation. We're going to look at it in 3 forms: substantiality, causality, and reciprocity. But notice, he calls this absolute relation. He's contrasting it with essential relation. What's the essential relation? the grounding relationship between essence and being. Absolute relation is where you don't have that hierarchy of one's the ground, the other is the ground dead. You don't have that anymore. That's been undermined. That's been taken away. What we have is this relation where both are equally fundamental. There is no substance that isn't accidentality. But that means that there's a power at work here. That's what's doing this. There's a power at work here, not it's at work here. It's a causal power. It brings them about. You hear causality here. Now, our ears are tempted to hear every time we hear causality, because we're still beholden to the modern sense of causality. We think mechanical causality. We think, oh, matter is inert. Matter doesn't move unless it's moved by something else, other matter hitting it. So billiard balls hitting billiard balls, right? We all know this sort of story. And Hegel's saying, right, I get all that, but let's set that aside, because that's a bunch of assumptions. If anything, we haven't shown that we haven't talked about matter. That's a further determination we haven't reached. But certainly, the entities that we have been talking about, they're not inert. If anything, they're constantly undergoing transformation and change. So they're not stable. They're not sitting there on their own, static, and they have to be intervened upon to be moved. So that whole mechanical causality framework just doesn't make any sense here. So when he's talking about causality here, think outside of the terms of mechanical causality, which we normally default to. Think about causality as nothing other than bringing something about. Bringing about producing something. If you'll think about it that way, then he'll say, well, initially it looks like that substance brings about accidents. So initially he'll say, we'll talk about a powerful substance. It's the way he ends the discussion of substantiality and accidentality. He says, we talk about a powerful substance, so we talk about a causal agent. So now we're starting to get right, manifestation, manifests what? It manifests power. What's the power? The causal power, the causal agent. Not mechanical, okay, fine, but it is a causal agent, and it brings about effects. And then Hegel takes you through an analysis that shows the following. You can separate cause and effect from the process of causality. Right? Cause is what is the agent of that process. Effect is the result of that process of causality. And you can talk about those two moments on their own terms. He calls that formal causality. Formal in Hegel always means you can extract these from the moments in which they're embedded, the process in which they're embedded. So you pull them out. You can talk about the cause on one side, you can talk about the effect on the other side. You can talk about causality as distinguishable from both. But no surprise here. The truth of formal causality is determinate causality. What does that mean? There is no effect without a cause. That one I like to start with, because that one's like, okay, right, yeah, duh, obvious. No effect without cause. Causes bring about effect, so we're good on that. But then Hegel wants to push that around. He wants to say, that also means there is no cause without an effect. That's the key one. Because if there is no cause without an effect, then the cause is not there before the causality. The cause is not there, sitting there. It's not dunamis, right? It's not potentiality. It's not waiting to happen. Right? There is no cause before the causality occurs. Well, when is the cause produced? It's produced by the effect arising. I think we just said that there is no cause without the effect. Right. And we just said that the cause is caused by the causation of the effect. You could even say, Hegel doesn't quite say this, but he's pretty close to saying it. It's a secondary effect. The cause is a secondary effect on producing the effect. Now it's really back-ass, right? We all know that you can't have effect without causes. Fine, unidirectional, you have a cause, it brings about an effect, we all know that, it makes perfect sense. It's temporally distinct like that, it's metaphysically distinct like that. We got that data. Hegel will say, okay, yeah, that's right. But the thought determinations require us to go further. We stop there, but the thought determination actually requires us to go further. The thought determinations require us to go to, there is no cause without there being an effect. That means the cause is caused by the production of the effect. The causality process produces both moments. He says, that's what we mean by action and reaction. So we got three kinds of causality. Formal causality, we can just talk about the two moments separated from the causal process itself. Determinate causality, think about the two moments as embedded within, or as moments within, or as products within the process of causality itself. But then that means eventually that that process on its own terms is nothing other than an action that produces a reaction. What's the reaction? The production of the cause. The action is the production of the effect, and produces the cause as its reaction, secondary effect. Now, make a little bit of sense? Now notice what you can do with that. If you think about causality, you think about it in terms of cause and effect. If you take these separable from causation, the process of causality itself, if you take the cause and effect as separable from that, then you can go, oh, well, what's the cause of that cause? Something else, so it's an effect of a prior cause. And you can set that back and keep going back. You can do, this is not surprising, an infinite regress. And you can similarly say, if you talk just about the effect, you can say, well, that effect is setting up as a cause for further effects and more effects. He runs the infinity argument on both sides. He says, you can do infinite regress, you can do an infinite progress. Except for, they're both generated by the same process. Because they're generated by the same process, then this isn't really a spurious infinity. You can do that. You can back up and back up and back up. You can go forward, go forward, go forward. Yeah, those directionalities are available. So just like we saw in the logic of being that there was spurious qualitative, spurious quantitative infinity, spurious nodal line infinity, we saw all that. Here, there is spurious causal infinity on both sides, the causal side on the effect side as well. But Hegel's argument immediately is to say, yes, that's true, that's there, that's right, absolutely there. But if you look at causality itself, if you look not at the formal side, but the determinate side, really the truth of the formal, if you look at that process, then what is it? Well, it is the cause coming to be, literally coming to be itself, by virtue of the effect being produced. So in a very strange passage, which we'll look at after the break, he says that means the process of causality bends back around upon itself. It doesn't go down one end ad infinitum, doesn't go down the other side ad infinitum. It actually bends back around into itself. It's self-constituting. Causality produces the effect and thereby produces the cause. You can say it the other way too. It produces the cause and thereby produces the effect. It works either way. But that's a self-relational, circular, or where Hegel's going with this when he talks about reciprocity, self-generative process. So what's the cause? What's mocked? Mocked is nothing other than, power is nothing other than this generation of itself out of nothing. Self-engendering. So Hegel says, if that argument makes sense, then the right name for that is freedom. Because freedom just means self-causation. And that's what we just showed, that causality, paradoxically, is. It generates itself. It's pure spontaneity. All right. That's an overview of the argument at the end of the actuality chapter. If you ask Hegel, right, what's the nature of reality? Manifestation. Speculative logic is the logic of the absolute. What's the absolute? Manifestation. What is manifestation? Well, it's got a form and it's got a content. Its form is absolute necessity, which is also absolute contingency, which is absolute negativity. It's got content. What is it? What's being revealed in it? The revealing itself. Well, what's the revealing? Power. What's that power? Self-constituting power. Self-constituting power. It produces effects and thereby produces its own cause. It causes itself. That's his answer. Everything you see in front of you, all observable entities in the world are the result of that going on. Everything can be accounted for in terms of that process going on. Now, that isn't sufficient to account for everything that exists, right? It can't tell you why certain things are, natural objects and certain things are cultural objects and all those kind of wonderful distinctions that are also real. But at the most basic ontological level, being qua being, why is there something rather than nothing? Because there's a process that generates itself in this precise way. And that's a process of absolute necessity, but that's also a process that generates itself of absolute freedom. Freedom names that same process. All right, we've got a couple minutes before we take the break. Questions, and we'll come back and look at text on this. Yeah.
Okay, so I totally understand that there is no cause without effect, because without the effect, the cause isn't a cause. But by the same virtue, you can say that the effect causes the cause, because the effect isn't an effect without the cause. So until the moment that both of them, the cause and effect, are two moments of the produced by causality itself, I'm fine with that. But the third movement, that effect produces its own cause, so that he can say that it's self-caused, so that it's freedom.
Self-causative.
Yeah.
That.
Because the effect isn't an effect without the causes there.
Right. It is only in its display. It is only in its manifesto. That's the effect, but it is the production of that effect. That's all it is. It is this, the movement of self-differentiation, which is self-determined. That's all it is. There's not something behind it. There's not some causal entity, substance or otherwise, that lies behind it. So there's no non-causal cause, right? There's no non-effect yet produced cause.
Okay, but it can only be manifested at the same moment when there is its own cause, right?
That's the only way in which it is. Remember, he says it is in its externalization. So there is no power that's lurking back there. So that's why I say it's not dunamis, right?
Okay,
we think about power a lot of times as potentiality built up and then unlocked, right, and expressed in some way. Hegel's very clear there's not something pent up here, namely power, that gets released at the moment of producing an effect. The power is only in the display itself. So there's no potentiality, actuality, metaphysics like we see in Aristotle, but not just in Aristotle.
Okay.
Does that help with that? I'm not saying that makes it easier
Okay,
to
yeah,
think.
yeah.
I think it makes it harder to think, harder to grasp, harder to comprehend. But I do think that's what Hegel's trying to claim, is that we're not entitled to saying there's something, because we've already been shown this is not a ground. That's what a dunamis would be. It'd be the ground of that which arises from it, a power that gives rise to something out of it. That would all be to reinstate us back into something we've already shown is vacuous, an essence unto itself, an in itself. There is no in itself. Does that help?
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but at least it helps to
Yeah,
comprehend.
but I
Yeah.
understand.
Other comments, questions? All right, what I'd like to do is take a break, about 10 minutes. Those of you who haven't met Maria, I'm sorry to pick you up. She's visiting class tonight, undergraduate in St. Mary's in Texas, and up to look at her program for a little bit. I encourage you guys to take a few minutes out and talk with her. She may have questions for you about the program, whatnot. Make yourself available to her, introduce yourself. We'll come back in about 10 minutes, 4:40, and we'll dig into some text and explore these same arguments through the textual side of it rather than just the diagram. So, all right, cool, thanks.